A man walks into a trading post with a dead wolf over his shoulder and walks out with a living woman at his side. No one asked him to do it. No one thanked him for it. Half the room laughed. The other half looked away. The woman didn't even meet his eyes. She was hollow, starving, already resigned to whatever came next. He didn't know her name. She didn't know his. And yet something in that room, something in the way she stood there like a person who had already stopped expecting to be saved, reached inside Gideon Voss and pulled at a knot he'd spent years trying to forget. That one trade. That one moment of weakness, or maybe it was strength, he still wasn't sure, would undo everything he'd built in the silence of those mountains. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The wolf had been dead for 3 days by the time Gideon Voss reached Harlan's Creek. He'd killed it on the second morning of his return journey, catching the animal's tracks in fresh snow just north of the ridge he called Widow's Back, a long, hunched stretch of granite that jutted from the mountain like a spine exposed by wind. The wolf had been following him, not hunting him exactly, more like waiting, like it was curious about this solitary man moving through its territory with 70 pounds of fur strapped to his back. Gideon had set a wire snare near a frozen creek bed and waited 8 hours in a pine blind with snow collecting on his shoulders. When the wolf finally came to investigate the scent of rabbit gut he'd used as bait, he put one shot through its chest from 40 yards. Clean, quick. He didn't feel good about it, but he didn't feel bad about it either. That was just the mathematics of survival up here. The wolf's pelt alone would fetch $2 at Harlan's trading post, maybe $2.50 if Rufus Harlan was in a generous mood, which he usually wasn't. Combined with the beaver, mink, and 2 fox pelts rolled tight in his pack, Gideon was looking at maybe $14 total if he negotiated well. Enough for coffee, salt, cornmeal, rifle powder, and one luxury item he'd been turning over in his mind for 3 weeks: a new wool blanket. His old one had developed a hole the size of his fist near the center, and no amount of patching had made it anything better than a cold draft waiting to find him in the night. He'd been alone on the mountain since early October, which made this late December, best he could figure. He didn't keep a proper calendar. Time moved differently in the high country. You measured it by snowfall depth, by the way the light shifted through the trees, by how deep the cold went into your bones at night. He'd lost count of the exact days somewhere in November, and he hadn't missed the count much. The settlement of Harlan's Creek was not much to look at. 7 permanent structures, 12 if you counted the outbuildings and the collapsed barn at the eastern edge that 2 brothers named Cook had been promising to fix for going on 4 years. The trading post itself was the heart of the place, a squat, heavy-timbered building with low ceilings and a fireplace that ran almost the full length of the north wall. It smelled like smoke and wet leather and something rancid that nobody ever identified. Gideon had been coming here twice a year for almost a decade, and the smell had never changed. He arrived mid-morning before the worst of the wind picked up again. His mule, a gray-brown animal of uncertain temper named Malcolm, had been agitated since the creek crossing 2 miles back and kept flicking his ears toward the tree line. Gideon didn't see anything in the trees worth worrying about, but he trusted Malcolm's instincts more than his own in certain matters, so he moved with his rifle at half-ready the last mile in. Nothing came out of the trees. He tied Malcolm at the post outside, gave the animal a rough pat on the neck that Malcolm tolerated without enthusiasm, and pushed through the door of the trading post. There were maybe a dozen people inside, which was crowded for Harlan's Creek. 3 men played cards at the far table, trappers by the look of them, rough-cut and quiet, in the way men who spent too much time alone tended to be quiet, like they'd forgotten the social machinery required to fill silence. 2 women stood near the dry goods shelf, one of them holding a bolt of gray cloth up to the window light. A young boy sat near the fireplace whittling something small and difficult. Rufus Harlan himself stood behind his counter, which was a wide plank of scarred oak that separated the man from his merchandise and from any trouble that might wander in looking for credit. Gideon set his pack down near the counter and began untying it without ceremony. "Voss, it'oar say," said Harlan. He was a large man, thick through the neck and chest, with a gray beard that had grown in irregular patches and small eyes that missed very little. He wasn't warm, but he was honest, or honest enough, which was the better version of the quality as far as Gideon was concerned. "Harlan, cold enough for you?" Getting there, Gideon began laying pelts on the counter. The beaver first, 4 of them, properly fleshed and dried, no rot, no tears in the hide. Then the 2 fox, which were good quality, the fur thick and dark-tipped from the deep cold. Then the mink. And finally the wolf, which he unrolled last, letting the full spread of it open on the counter. Harlan leaned forward and ran a hand along the wolf's back. He didn't say anything for a moment. "That's a big animal," he said finally. "Big enough. Where'd you take him?" "North Ridge. Been tracking the creek bed for a week." Harlan straightened up and crossed his arms, doing the arithmetic in his head with the expression of a man who was adding numbers that kept coming out too high for his comfort. "I can do 12 for the lot," he said. Gideon didn't react. He pulled the wolf pelt back across the counter toward himself and began re-rolling it slowly. "I'll take the wolf to Danner's post at the junction then. He's been paying better on wolf this season. 12 for what's left." "Danner's 3 days from here." "I know where Danner's is." A pause. Harlan tugged at his beard. 1350. Final. Gideon stopped rolling the wolf pelt. He set it back down on the counter. 14. 1375. 14. Harlan made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite agreement and not quite protest. Something in between that served as his way of saying fine without actually saying it. He turned to write the figure in his ledger. That was when the noise started near the back of the room. It wasn't a loud noise at first, more of a low argument, the kind of conversation that starts with reasonable voices and gradually loses its reasonableness without either party quite noticing. Gideon heard it behind him while Harlan was scratching numbers, and he didn't turn around immediately because arguments at trading posts were not unusual and were generally not his concern. But then he heard a woman's voice, small, tense, trying not to be heard. And that was different enough to make him turn. There were 4 of them in the back corner near the stacked flour sacks. 2 men Gideon didn't recognize, broad, work-hardened, the kind of men who moved lumber or dug irrigation ditches, wearing the particular expression of people who believed themselves to be negotiating, and a 3rd man who appeared to be doing the talking, slight and hollow-cheeked, maybe 30 years old but looking older, with a desperation around his eyes that Gideon recognized as the specific desperation of someone who has run out of most options and is currently exploring the last few. The 4th was a young woman standing slightly behind the desperate man, not hiding, exactly. More like she'd learned that slightly behind was the safest place to be. She was young, early 20s, maybe younger. It was hard to tell beneath the layers. She wore a coat that was too large for her, a man's coat, the kind you took because it was available, not because it fit. Her dark hair had been pinned up badly, several strands loose against her neck. Her face was oval, thin in the way that suggested a longer thinness rather than natural build, with dark smudges under her eyes that had nothing to do with shadow and everything to do with exhaustion. She was looking at a fixed point on the floor, approximately 3 feet in front of her. She was not looking at anyone. She had made herself, in some essential way, absent from the conversation happening around her. Gideon watched for a moment, reading the geometry of it. The desperate man was talking to the 2 workers, gesturing. The 2 workers were looking at the young woman with the flat, evaluating look of men pricing livestock. The young woman kept looking at the floor. He turned back to the counter. None of his business. Harlan had laid out his supplies: coffee, salt, cornmeal, powder, the wool blanket. Gideon checked the amounts against his mental list. The blanket was heavy and good, deep green, probably traded from somewhere east. Behind him, the conversation in the corner got louder. "Told you. I need her placed somewhere she'll be fed. We feed her, we expect work. You understand what kind of work. She's useful. She can cook. She can—" "Don't need a cook, Renly." Gideon's hands stilled on the blanket. Renly. That was the desperate man's name then. He filed it without meaning to. "I can't take her back north. We've got nothing up there. She'll starve, same as me. I need someone to—" "Look, we'll give you $4 and you forget—" The woman still hadn't moved, still looking at the floor, 3 feet in front of her. Not 3 feet away, but something else. Something further. Gideon put the blanket down. He told himself later, when he tried to reconstruct the logic of what he did next, that there was no logic. That was the honest answer. He'd seen bad things in trading posts before and kept walking. He'd seen men treated worse than livestock and said nothing because saying something had consequences, and he'd made a life out of avoiding consequences. He was good at that life. He was comfortable in it. But the way she was looking at the floor, like she'd already agreed to whatever happened next, like she'd agreed a long time ago and had just been waiting for the transaction to catch up with her. He picked up the wolf pelt. He walked to the back of the room and the conversation stopped when he arrived, because Gideon Voss was not a small man, and he had the habit of movement that made people pay attention. 6 feet and some change, broad across the shoulder, with a dark beard and eyes that were gray in low light and almost green in direct sun. 34 years old, looked both older and younger at the same time, depending on the angle. He looked at the 3 men, and none of them said anything. "I'll take her," Gideon said. His voice came out level. He wasn't sure it would. The desperate man, Renly, blinked at him. "I'm sorry?" "I'm saying I'll take her off your hands." He held up the wolf pelt. "This against whatever arrangement you're in the middle of making." One of the 2 workers laughed. It was a short laugh, not unkind exactly, just the laugh of someone who has encountered something unexpected. "You're buying her?" "I'm trading for her." There was a distinction, and he felt it mattered, though he couldn't have explained precisely why. "Same as anything else in this room." Renly looked at him with the rapid, searching look of a man trying to determine whether this was rescue or a different kind of trouble. "She's my sister," he said, as if this established something. "I know. I'm not selling her. I know what you're doing." Gideon's voice didn't shift. "And I know what they're going to do with her. So," he held the pelt out. "Wolf, prime condition, taken 3 days ago. Harlan will tell you what it's worth. More than $4, I'll tell you that." The room had gone quiet. Not the natural quiet of a trading post at mid-morning, but the deliberate quiet of people who have decided to pay attention to something that might be worth remembering. The card players had stopped their game. The woman with the bolt of cloth had lowered it from the window. Renly looked at the wolf pelt. He looked at his sister. Something moved across his face that Gideon couldn't name. Not relief, not shame, but something that had elements of both, complicated by love or the remnants of it. "You don't even know her," Renly said. It came out quiet, almost like an accusation. "No," Gideon agreed. "I don't." One of the 2 workers spoke up. "Now hold on, You had an offer," Gideon said, and he looked at the man for the first time with the flat, uncomplicated attention of someone who has finished discussing the matter. He didn't accept it. The worker held his look for a moment and then looked somewhere else. Renly took the wolf pelt. His hand shook slightly as he took it. He rolled it against his chest and his eyes moved to his sister, and for a moment something broke in his face. Not dramatic, not a crumbling, just a brief fracturing, and then he pressed it closed again. "Lena," he said. The young woman looked up for the first time. Her eyes found her brother's and then, with what appeared to be considerable effort, found Gideon's face. Brown eyes. Dark, deep brown, with the particular quality of someone who has learned to take in information without revealing that they're taking it in. She looked at him the way you'd look at a locked door, measuring the distance between yourself and the thing on the other side. "This is Gideon Voss," Renly said. He said it with the formal precision of a man performing a task he doesn't fully believe in. "He's a trapper. Renly swallowed. "He'll see you, right?" Lena didn't answer. She looked at Gideon, and her expression said nothing and everything at once. They stood outside the trading post in the cold, while Malcolm regarded them both with his usual gray skepticism. Gideon had collected his supplies, all of them except the blanket, which he'd left on the counter because the arithmetic no longer worked in his favor, and was repacking his mule. Lena Hart stood a few feet away, holding a small bundle of cloth that appeared to contain everything she owned, which wasn't much. A flat canvas roll the size of a loaf of bread, tied with twine. Gideon checked Malcolm's load balance and didn't look at her. "You don't have to come," he said. "That wasn't part of the trade. The trade was just getting you out of that room." She was quiet for a moment. The wind came through the settlement, and she pulled the too large coat tighter. "Where else would I go?" she said. It wasn't self-pity. It was an honest question, stated plainly, the way practical people state practical problems. "I don't know. That's my point. You've got options now." "What options?" He straightened up and looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time. She was looking back at him with those measuring brown eyes, not hostile, not grateful, just very much present and very much waiting for a real answer. There's a family 3 settlements east, he said. Meredith family. They took in 2 other women last winter. It's not fancy, but they're decent people. You know them personally? I know of them. That's different. Yes, he admitted. It is. She looked east for a moment, in the direction he gestured. Then she looked at him. And where are you going? North, into the mountains. I've got a cabin a day and a half from here. Alone? That was the plan, yes. She nodded slowly, turning this information over. He watched her do it. There was a methodical quality to the way she thought. He could see it in her face. Not slow, but careful. Like someone who had made the mistake of moving without thinking and was determined not to repeat it. I'll come with you, she said, if that's still the offer. It wasn't exactly an offer. Then what was it? He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them seemed entirely sure what it was. Come on, he said finally. He handed her Malcolm's lead rope. He bites if you grab the bridle, but he's all right with the rope. She took the rope. Malcolm turned his large head to examine her, and she met his gaze without flinching, which Gideon noted. What do I do if he bites anyway? She asked. Bite him back. She glanced at him sidelong. He couldn't tell if she thought he was joking. He wasn't, particularly. They walked for the first 3 hours without talking much, which suited Gideon well enough. The trail north of Harlan's Creek climbed steadily through a forest of bare aspen and thick-needled fir, the snow on the ground ranging from ankle-deep in the open sections to waist-deep in the shadowed hollows where the trees grew dense and the sun never quite reached. The cold was steady and serious, not the dramatic killing cold of a storm, but the patient, grinding cold of a long winter settling into its bones. He watched her move from the corner of his eye. She walked well, better than he expected given her apparent condition. She stayed in his tracks where the snow was deep, which was the sensible thing to do, and she kept pace without complaint. She hadn't asked to stop. She hadn't asked how much further. She just walked. After an hour, she'd stopped shaking. He wasn't sure when exactly. It might have been the exertion warming her up, or it might have been something else. The mountains doing what they sometimes did to people who actually looked at them rather than flinching away. At midday, he stopped at a wind-broken clearing and built a small fire from the dead wood he carried in his pack. Never trust to find dry wood when you need it. That was rule 1, and set water to boil. He had jerked venison and hard biscuit in his pack. He handed her a portion without ceremony. She ate quickly, with the focused attention of someone who had learned not to trust food to still be there in 5 minutes. He watched this without comment. How long have you been up here? She asked, when the food was mostly gone. In the mountains, near 10 years. In that cabin, 7. Alone the whole time. He looked at the fire. Mostly. She seemed to hear the weight in that word and didn't press it, which he appreciated. Where are you from originally? He asked. He wasn't sure why he asked. Probably because the silence had become slightly less comfortable once she'd asked her question, and he felt obligated to fill it with something. East, Indiana. Small place. You wouldn't know it. She brushed biscuit crumbs from her coat. My parents died when I was 14. Fever. After that, it was Renly and me. How long ago was today? With Renly? She looked at her hands. He's not a bad man, she said. It came out like something she'd had to remind herself recently. He just ran out of road. We both did. I wasn't judging him. You were a little. He opened his mouth and then closed it, because she was right. He had been, a little. He's been carrying me for 2 years, she said. I know what that does to a person. I know he didn't have another idea. Gideon poured 2 cups of coffee from the small tin pot, more boiled water than coffee he was rationing, and handed her one. She took it with both hands and held it. Thank you, she said quietly. For the coffee or for the earlier trade, he couldn't tell. Maybe both. Don't thank me yet, he said. You haven't seen the cabin. Is it bad? It's adequate. What does that mean? It means it's standing and it keeps the wind out, mostly. She was quiet for a moment, then, mostly. Strong wind from the northeast sometimes finds a gap near the back wall. I've been meaning to chink it for 2 years. She looked at him over her coffee cup with the particular expression of someone who has decided to take a situation for what it is and not what they might have hoped it would be. All right, she said. The storm found them 6 miles from the cabin. Gideon had been watching the sky for the last 2 hours, a specific blue-gray color developing in the northwest that he'd learned, over years of close attention, meant serious weather was coming. Not in days. Hours. He picked up the pace and didn't explain why, and she matched it without asking. That was the second time he noted something about her. Malcolm didn't like the wind shift and communicated this by stopping twice and having to be persuaded with some effort to continue. By the time they hit the last ridge before the descent to the cabin, the wind had picked up to the kind of speed that made forward movement feel personal, like the weather was taking it personally that you were still moving. The cabin came into view at dusk. Low-roofed, squat, built from the heavy timber of the surrounding forest, it sat in a natural hollow at the base of a granite outcropping that broke the north wind. There was a small outbuilding for Malcolm and what remained of a woodpile under an overhang on the south side. Gideon had left it well stocked before his trading trip, but the cover had slipped in the wind and snow had gotten into the top 2 rows. He got Malcolm settled in the outbuilding with feed and water. When he came back to the cabin door, Lena was standing in the small entrance room. Barely a room, more of a cold break, 4 feet deep, looking at the interior. He'd kept it clean, which he'd always done for himself, but it was plainly a man's space. 1 room, 1 table, 1 chair, 1 bunk along the wall, narrow and practical, with a canvas tick and his patched blanket folded on top. A cast-iron stove in the center. Shelves along the east wall with organized rows of supplies, tools, dried herbs, a few books. A rack near the door where his other coat and hat hung. One of everything. She stood in the entrance and didn't say anything for a long moment. "I'll build a second bunk," he said. "Tomorrow or the next day. Give me time to split the timber." "All right," she said. Her voice was even. "You take the existing one tonight. I'll use the floor." "You don't have to. I sleep on the floor fine. Done it plenty." He moved past her to the stove and began laying the fire. "Get your outer things off and hang them by the door. They'll need to dry." She did. He built the fire without looking at her. By the time the stove was drawing well and the first heat was creeping into the room, she was standing closer to it, her hands extended toward the warmth with the instinctive trust of a frozen person near a flame. Outside, the storm arrived like it meant business. The wind hit the north face of the cabin, and the whole structure seemed to breathe inward once, the walls flexing slightly, and then it steadied and held. The stove ticked and popped as the iron expanded in the heat. Snow drove against the small window in sheets. Gideon sat in his 1 chair and watched the fire through the stove's iron grate. Lena sat on the edge of the bunk and looked at her hands. They were strangers in a very small space during a very large storm, and neither of them had any idea what came next. That was, Gideon thought, about as honest a description of his life as any he could think of. In the days that followed, they established something that neither of them had named. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't anything with a clear word attached to it. It was more like the way 2 people share a space when they've both been alone long enough to have forgotten the minor negotiations required for coexistence and are figuring it out again from the beginning. He built her the second bunk, which took 2 days, cutting and splitting the timber, fitting the frame, lashing the joints, stretching a canvas tick. He put it on the opposite wall from his, which gave them both the maximum available distance in a 14-foot room. She watched him build it without offering to help and without looking away. And when it was done, she said, "That looks solid," and ran her hand along the frame, and he couldn't tell if she was testing it structurally or just acknowledging the work. "It'll hold," he said. "I know. I was just—" She stopped. "Thank you." He nodded and went to sharpen his knife, which needed doing anyway. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of close quarters and the particular intimacy of a small space in a big storm, where you learn things about people whether you want to or not. He learned that she woke early, earlier than him usually, which was something, and that she moved quietly in the mornings, like she was trying not to disturb a silence that was still valuable. He learned that she didn't talk much unless she had something to say, which he respected. He learned that she knew how to cook, not fancy but practical, economical with fuel and ingredients, the cooking of someone who had been feeding people on not enough for a long time. She made a stew on the second day of the storm from the dried venison in his stores and some dried herbs she'd found on his shelf, and it was better than anything he'd cooked for himself in months. He told her so. "It's not hard," she said. "You had everything you needed." It just needed time. He thought about that later after she'd gone to sleep and he was sitting with the fire low and the storm working itself out against the walls. It needed time. He'd had everything he needed for a long time and hadn't known it, or had forgotten it, which amounted to the same thing. He sat with that thought for a while and then put it somewhere he could examine later and went to sleep. The end of the storm brought cold so sharp it had a sound to it, a crystalline quality in the air that made every sound carry further and cleaner than normal. Gideon's breath came out in long plumes. The snow on the ground had crusted overnight into a surface hard enough to walk on without snowshoes if you were careful about it. He spent the morning of the fourth day resetting traps he'd left dormant for the trading trip, working the line east from the cabin through the lower timber. He was back by early afternoon, 2 rabbits and a marten in his pack. He found Lana outside the cabin with his axe. She'd gotten into the woodpile, the snow-wet top rows he hadn't gotten to, and was splitting what had dried out enough to be workable. She swung the axe with the specific competence of someone who had split wood before and knew that the technique mattered more than the strength. Not good exactly, but better than he expected, not wasting energy. He watched her for a moment from the tree line before she heard his approach in the snow. She stopped and looked at him, and something moved across her face that might have been concern that she'd overstepped. "I figured it needed doing," she said. "It did. I wasn't sure where else to—" "No, it's good." He came down the slope and set his pack down. "How's your shoulder?" She looked at it reflexively. "Fine. The axe has a pull to the left. You'll feel it tomorrow if you went at it hard." She looked at the axe handle and then at him. "I'll be fine." "All right." He picked up where she'd left off, and she watched him for a moment and then went inside. And through the small window he could see her start the stove for cooking, the smoke beginning to rise from the chimney in a straight line against the white sky. He split wood until his arms burned and the pile under the overhang was twice what it had been, and he didn't examine why he'd done more than was necessary. He found out about the baby on a night in late January. He came back from a 2-day trap run later than expected, navigating the last mile in full dark with a torch and a set of tracks he'd been following by feel as much as sight. He was cold down to the specific cold that lives in the small bones of the feet, the kind that takes an hour by a good fire to properly thaw. He pushed open the cabin door and stepped into the warmth and found Lena sitting on her bunk with both hands pressed flat against her stomach. She didn't move them when he came in, not immediately. And then she did, quickly, dropping them to her sides, and looked at the fire. He'd hung his things up and was working his boots off before the image finished processing. He looked at her again. The way she'd been sitting, the position of her hands, the coat she'd been wearing inside, which she'd started doing 2 weeks ago and he'd assumed was against the cold. He looked at her and she looked at the fire with the absolute stillness of someone who is waiting for a sentence to be delivered. "Lena," he said. "Don't," she said, quietly. "How far along?" A long pause. The fire popped. 5 months, I think," she said. "Maybe close to 6. She still wasn't looking at him. "I know what you're going to say." "You don't. You're going to say you didn't bargain for this, that it changes things." He was quiet. He sat down in his chair and looked at his hands for a moment. "Whose is it?" he asked. Not because it changed anything, but because he wanted the full picture. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "A man in Indiana," she said finally. "He's married. He has been the whole time. I didn't know until—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter. He's not part of this. He made that very clear." He nodded. "Renly knew," she said. "That's part of why—" Another stop. "That's why he was trying to place me somewhere. He didn't know what else to do. You were hiding it in that trading post. I was hiding it everywhere." He got up and went to the stove and poured water for coffee. His hands were still half numb, and the tin of the pot was warm against his palms. He poured 2 cups and brought one to her, and she took it with both hands the same way she'd taken the first cup on the trail, the day he met her. She was looking at him now. He could feel it. "Say it," she said. "Whatever you're going to say, just say it." He looked at her. Frightened, he realized. Under all that composure and that careful measuring look, she was frightened in a very specific animal way. The way a person is frightened when they have run out of corridor and are standing at the last door. "I'm going to need to know more about what supplies we'll need," he said. For the birth. What to get on the next run to Harlan's. So I should probably know when you expect the baby. She stared at him. If it's 5 months, he said, that puts us at late April, early May. Storm season should be breaking by then. That's something. Her mouth opened slightly and then closed. I don't know anything about delivering a baby, he continued, aware that he was filling silence because the alternative was letting her cry, and something told him she'd rather not. So I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know about it so I can figure out what I need to learn. She was still staring at him. I know some things, she said after a moment. Her voice was slightly unsteady. I helped with a birth once. A neighbor. Good, that's more than I know. Gideon, go to sleep, he said. We'll make a list tomorrow, what we have and what we need. She didn't say anything for a moment. He went back to his chair and his coffee and the fire, and he heard her eventually lie down and pull her blanket up, and the cabin was quiet except for the fire and the cold wind working at the northeast corner of the wall. He sat there for a long time. He told himself for years that he'd chosen this life. The silence and the solitude and the clean, uncomplicated mathematics of survival. He told himself it was preference, not retreat. He told himself a lot of things, in a lot of years of telling himself things. He looked at the fire and let those stories sit without defending them, and found that they were lighter than they used to be. Or maybe just more honest about what they were. Outside, the mountain held its cold and immense silence. Inside, 2 people breathed in the warmth of a fire someone had kept burning. And that, for now, was enough. The list took 3 days to make properly. Not because it was complicated, though it was, but because Lena didn't offer information easily and Gideon didn't ask questions well. They were 2 people who had both learned, through different routes and different kinds of damage, that needing things from other people was a liability. Asking required a certain vulnerability that neither of them was practiced at. So the list came out in pieces. A line here, a detail there, usually while they were doing something else. While she was cooking, or he was mending harness leather, or one of them was watching the fire with the distant, inward look of someone sorting through old inventory. She told him, on the first day, that she'd need clean cloth. A lot of it, more than he probably thought. For what? He asked. For everything, she said, and her tone suggested this was obvious, and also that she was not going to elaborate unless pushed. He wrote cloth on the list and didn't push. On the second day, she told him that a knife would need to be boiled. He looked up from his work. I have 3 knives. The smallest one, she said, and something to tie the cord with. Twine, but clean twine, not the kind you use for traps. He wrote it down. On the third day, she sat across from him at the table while he reviewed what they had in stores against what she'd told him would be needed, and she watched him work through the numbers the way she'd watched him build the bunk. That quiet attention that didn't announce itself. You're not going to ask me, she said. He kept writing. Ask you what? How I'm feeling about it. Everyone always asks that. Did it help when they asked? A pause. Not particularly. Then no, he said. I wasn't going to ask. She was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the snow was doing its mid-January thing of falling sideways, driven hard by a wind that had been running out of the northeast since morning. The cabin was warm. He'd split enough wood to last a week and had stacked it inside the door where it could dry further, and the stove was working properly, the heat even and settled. I'm scared, she said. Not to him exactly. More like to the room. He put down the pencil. That's reasonable. I've seen it go wrong. I know. The neighbor I helped, the one I told you about. It took a long time and there was a lot of blood and... She stopped, pressed her lips together, looked at the window. The baby lived. She lived too. But for a while I wasn't sure she would. He was quiet. He knew the right response to this was not reassurance because reassurance would be dishonest and she was too sharp to accept dishonest comfort. What she'd described was real. It happened. The mountains were full of small graves that testified to how often it happened. I'll be here, he said finally. Whatever I need to know, I'll learn it, and I'll be here. She looked at him then, and the measuring quality in her eyes was there but quieter than usual, like the instrument had been set down for a moment. All right, she said. She picked up her piece of cloth while she'd been mending one of his shirts while they talked, using it as something for her hands to do, which he'd noticed people needed sometimes, and went back to the stitching. He picked up the pencil and went back to the list. The list eventually ran to 2 pages. He took it to Harlan's Creek alone 12 days later. On a morning so cold the trees cracked around him on the descent like rifle shots, and he bought everything on it with the last of the season's trapping money, and more he'd been keeping in a tin beneath the floorboard for what he'd always vaguely thought of as when something comes up. He hadn't known what something would be. Now he did. When he got back that evening, the cabin smelled like pine sap and something faintly sweet he couldn't identify, and Lena had rearranged his shelf to make space she'd been planning, apparently for some time. He stood in the doorway with his pack and looked at the rearranged shelf. "You moved my things." "I put them on the lower shelf. They're all there. I had a system. Your system put the salt above the cornmeal, and when the salt sack leaked last week, it went straight into the cornmeal." He opened his mouth and then closed it, because this was accurate. He hadn't noticed the leak until he'd tasted the cornmeal and found it wrong, and he'd been annoyed about it for 2 days without determining the source. He set his pack down and began unpacking the supplies from Harlan's, and she took them from him one by one and placed them on the shelves in the spaces she'd made, with a specificity that told him she'd been planning this arrangement while he was gone. "I put the cloth in the trunk," she said, "under the bunk." "Good." He handed her the last package, a small tin of dried chamomile he'd found behind Harlan's counter, traded from somewhere south, listed in her handwriting at the bottom of the second page with the note that said, "If available, not essential." He'd paid extra for it. She looked at the tin and then at him. "It wasn't on the essential list," she said. "I know. Harlan had it." She turned the tin over in her hands. Her expression was complicated in the way that simple things sometimes got complicated when you'd been without them long enough. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than her usual voice. He went to hang up his coat and said nothing, because nothing seemed like the right response. The weeks after that had their own rhythm. February came in with a cold that was biblical in its thoroughness, temperatures dropping so far at night that the water in the kettle set back from the stove had a skim of ice by morning. Gideon ran his trap line every 3rd day when the weather allowed, which was not always. The rest of the time he split wood, mended equipment, read from the small collection of books on his shelf, and gradually, without planning it, began talking to Lena Hart more than he'd talked to another person in years. It happened the way most things happen between them. Sideways, never directly. They'd be doing something ordinary, and one of them would say something that opened a door, and the other would look at the door and decide, that day, to walk through it. She asked him once on a gray February afternoon while she was teaching herself to resole a boot using his tools, and he was doing absolutely nothing, just sitting, which he did sometimes, which she'd learned to read as a particular kind of rest. She asked him why he'd come up here in the first place. He looked at the window for a while before answering. Had some things to get away from. What kind of things? He considered not answering, which was his instinct, then considered what she had and hadn't told him, and felt the weight of that reciprocity. "I had a wife," he said, 7 years ago. "Her name was Clara. She died. Fever, same as your parents." He paused. "We had a son. He was 4. He died 3 weeks after she did." Lena put down the boot tool. "His name was Thomas," Gideon said. He said it carefully, like a man lifting something fragile that hadn't been lifted in a long time. "He had her eyes. I thought that was going to matter, that I'd see her in him, and it would be some kind of comfort." He looked at his hands. Instead, it made it worse, for a while. And then he was just gone too, and there was nothing left to remind me of anything, and somehow that was worse than the reminding. He shook his head slowly. "I packed what I could carry and came north, kept going until the distance felt right." "Did it ever feel right?" He thought about it. "Yes and no. The mountain doesn't care about anything you've done or lost or broken. That's either comforting or terrible, depending on the day." She picked up the boot tool again but didn't use it, just held it. "I think I understand that," she said quietly. "I know you do," he said. Not unkindly. They sat with that for a while, the two of them in the warm room with the gray light coming through the window and the cold doing its patient work outside. He thought about Thomas sometimes, at night, when the cabin was dark and quiet, and there was nothing between him and the things he kept in the back rooms of his mind. He'd gotten better at it over the years. The grief had changed shape, gone from something sharp and constant to something duller and intermittent, the way an old injury sometimes goes quiet for months and then reminds you it's still there when you move a certain way. He'd made a kind of peace with it. Not the peace that meant it didn't hurt, the peace that meant he could carry it without it carrying him. But something about Lena's pregnancy, about the daily reality of another life growing in the space of this cabin, the way she moved differently now, more carefully, one hand sometimes going to her middle without her seeming to notice she was doing it, something about all of that had brought old things closer to the surface. He didn't know if that was good or bad. He'd stopped trying to categorize things as good or bad when it came to grief, because the categories never quite fit. March arrived, and with it a false thaw that lasted 4 days and fooled no one who knew the mountains. The snow softened and pulled back from the south-facing rock faces, and a smell came up from the earth that was almost like something living. And then the temperature dropped 30 degrees in one night, and everything locked back up harder than before. Gideon had seen it happen every year and was still almost fooled. He'd started to think about the spring garden, the small plot south of the cabin where he grew what he could, potatoes and onions mostly, and had to pull himself back. Too early. Too much winter left. Lena had started nesting, which was the word he landed on, though he hadn't known the word applied to people until he saw it happening. She organized things, reorganized them, made small improvements to the cabin with what was available. She'd taken a piece of old canvas and stitched it into something she hung over the northeast corner where the draft came in, which cut the cold there noticeably. She'd cleaned every surface in the cabin, including surfaces he'd been ignoring for years. She repaired 2 of his shirts and a pair of socks using thread she'd unraveled from a worn-out blanket edge and rewound onto a carved stick of her own making. She didn't ask if she could do these things. She just did them, with the focused, slightly restless energy of someone whose body was building something large and complicated and who needed her hands occupied while it did. He said nothing about it, which was his way of approving. They fought for the first time in the 3rd week of March, over something small that wasn't actually about the small thing. He told her not to go past the tree line on the south slope while he was running traps. There'd been mountain lion sign in the area for a week, prints in the snow, a kill site he'd found on his last run, a deer taken down clean. He told her about it matter-of-factly, and she'd nodded with the same practical attentiveness she applied to most information, and he'd thought that was settled. He came back to find her tracks leading exactly to the tree line and then stopping there, which meant she'd gone to the tree line and stood at it and probably debated it before coming back. He followed the tracks and confirmed they came back to the cabin, so she hadn't gone beyond, technically. Technically. "I told you not to go to the tree line," he said when he came in. His voice was flat and tight in a way that had nothing to do with anger at her and everything to do with what he'd spent the last half-mile imagining while following those tracks. She looked up from the pot she was tending. "I didn't go past it. I said stay away from it. I know what you said. I went to the edge. I stopped. The lion doesn't know where your edge is." She straightened up and turned to face him fully, and he saw in her face the same tight thing he was feeling, the thing that happens when someone's been careful and treated like they haven't been. "I'm not an idiot, Gideon. I know what's out there. I went to the edge, and I looked at the trees, and I came back. I was inside for 11 days straight, and I needed to—" She stopped, looked at the window. "I needed to see the open space." He stood in the doorway with cold air coming off him and the tension of misread tracks still in his chest. "I understand that," he said after a moment. "I don't need a guard." "I'm not trying to be your guard." "Then what are you trying to be?" The question landed in the room and sat there, unexpected, too large for what had started it. He looked at her. She looked at him, both of them slightly off balance. "I don't know," he said honestly. She turned back to the pot. The spoon made a sound against the iron. Outside, the wind had picked up again and was working at the northwest corner of the roof. "I know you were scared when you saw the tracks," she said, without turning around. Her voice was different now. The edge had come off it. "I'm not saying that didn't matter. It mattered. I know." The fire made its soft, regular sounds. He hung up his things and came to the stove and stood near it and let the warmth take the cold out of his coat. "Tomorrow," he said, "if you need to see the open space, tell me. I'll take you out to the clearing on the east side. Lion's been west all week." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. They ate without talking much that night. But it was the comfortable silence, not the strained one, which told him something had been said that needed saying, even if neither of them could have named exactly what. The baby moved for the first time that Gideon was aware of in early April. He knew Lena had been feeling movement for weeks. She'd mentioned it once, briefly, in the detached, informational way she mentioned physical things. But he hadn't thought much about what that meant in practical terms until one evening when she made a sharp sound in the middle of saying something and pressed her hand flat against her side. He looked up from his book. "It kicked," she said. She sounded slightly startled, which meant it had been stronger than usual. He looked at her hand against her side and then back at his book. "Here," she said, and there was something in her voice he hadn't heard before, something unguarded, younger than her usual register. She reached out toward him and then stopped, reconsidering, her hand in the air between them. He put his book down. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bunk, and she took his hand, which was larger than hers, rougher, and pressed it flat against her side. She held it there. He felt it, a small distinct pressure against his palm, something pushing back. He didn't say anything. He sat there with his hand pressed to the side of a stranger who was no longer exactly a stranger, feeling a life he hadn't asked for and hadn't planned, pushing back against the world from the inside, and something in his chest moved that hadn't moved in a very long time. Not dramatically, not the way things moved in the stories he'd read, where men had revelations with weather to accompany them, just quietly, like a door opened somewhere that had been stuck for years and opened easy, now, because something had shifted in the frame. He took his hand back after a moment and stood up. "Strong," he said. She looked up at him with her measuring eyes, but the measuring was different now, softer at the edges. "Yes," she said. He went back to his chair and picked up his book and didn't read a word of it for 20 minutes, and she lay back on her bunk and looked at the ceiling with one hand still resting on her side. And the fire kept doing what fires do, and the mountain kept doing what mountains do. And neither of them spoke again that night, but the silence between them had changed into something that neither of them quite had the word for yet, and neither of them was in any particular hurry to find one. The cold still held in the last weeks of April, but it was changing, the specific heaviness going out of it, replaced by something thinner and less permanent. Gideon started watching the sky with a different kind of attention, the attention he saved for transitions, for the moments when one thing ended and another began. The snow on the south face had gone gray and dense and was pulling away from the rocks in long, slow fissures. The creek below the cabin, which had been silent under ice for months, was beginning to find its voice again. A low sound, barely audible, the sound of something trying to move. There was still time. She'd said early May, maybe late April. The calendar he'd been keeping, scratched into the wooden shelf post with a knife line for every day, said April 22nd. 8 or 9 days, maybe. Maybe less. He went to the clearing on the east side one evening while the light was still good, ostensibly to check the signs of the season. He stood in the open space where the trees pulled back and the sky opened wide and blue and enormous, and he thought about what was coming, about what he knew and didn't know, about the small knife, boiled clean, sitting in a folded cloth on the shelf Lena had rearranged, about the clean twine, about the cloth she'd stacked in the trunk under her bunk. He'd read everything he could find. There wasn't much in his collection, one brief passage in a general frontier medicine book, 4 pages that covered the subject with the same brisk economy as everything else in that book. He'd asked Harlan's wife, discreetly, on his last trip, and she'd given him a look that contained equal parts respect and alarm, and then told him, in practical terms, what to expect and what to do. He'd asked her twice about the things he wasn't sure he understood, and she'd answered both times without condescension. He'd done what he could do. The rest was what it was. The creek below found a new note in its running. Higher, lighter, something ice-free in it. He listened to it for a while in the clean evening air. Then he went back up the slope to the cabin, where light was coming through the window, where Lena Hart was moving around inside in the way she'd been moving lately, careful, deliberate, the movements of someone carrying weight and knowing exactly how much they were carrying. He went inside. She was standing at the shelf, looking at the folded cloth that held the knife, one hand resting on the wood. She heard him come in but didn't turn around immediately. 8 days, he said. Give or take. Give or take, she agreed. She still didn't turn around. He could hear it in her breathing. Not distress, but the particular quality of someone standing at the edge of something large and looking at it without flinching, because flinching wasn't available to them, or maybe just because they decided it wasn't. He went to the stove and put more wood on the fire, because the evening was cooling fast, and she needed to stay warm, and the baby needed warmth, and sometimes the most important things you could do were exactly that simple and exactly that hard at the same time. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah." "I'm glad it was you," she said. "In that trading post. I'm glad you were the one who—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I just wanted to say that." He looked at the fire through the grate for a moment. "Me too," he said. She nodded once, as if something had been confirmed, and went to sit on her bunk, and the fire grew in the stove, and outside the mountain was making its first tentative gestures toward spring. The morning Gideon left for the hunting trip, Lena stood in the doorway and watched him go without saying anything she was actually thinking. What she was thinking was, "Don't go." What she said was, "Be back before dark if you can." He'd nodded and adjusted the pack on his shoulders and headed north along the tree line without looking back, because looking back was not something Gideon Voss did. She'd learned that about him over the months. He committed to directions. Once he was moving, and the looking was done before the first step. She watched until the trees took him, and then went back inside to the close warmth of the cabin and sat at the table and put her hands flat on the wood and took 3 slow breaths. The food situation had become serious in the last week of April. Not desperate, they weren't at the point of empty shelves, but the stores had run lower than Gideon had planned for, partly because feeding 2 people through a hard winter took more than feeding one, and partly because the late cold had pushed the hunting back further than any of them had wanted. The cornmeal was down to half a sack. The dried venison was gone. They had salt, coffee, some dried beans, and not enough of any of it to last more than 3 or 4 more weeks. She was 7.5 months along now, by their best estimate. Heavy and slow and aware of her body in a way that was sometimes wonder and sometimes dread, and usually both at the same time. The baby had settled low in the last 10 days, which Lena knew from the neighbor's birth meant the end was moving closer, though how close was anyone's guess. Gideon had argued with himself about the hunting trip for 3 days before deciding. She'd watched him argue. He did it quietly, internally, but she'd gotten good at reading the internal arguments in the set of his jaw and the way he went still sometimes, sitting at the table or standing at the window, clearly working through something she wasn't being invited to see. On the 3rd day, he'd told her he needed to go north, into the higher timber where a herd of elk had been working the ridgeline. He'd seen their sign on his last trap run. 2 days out, maybe 3, and he'd come back with enough meat to last them past the birth and into early summer. "I'll be fine," she'd said. She meant it. She was not afraid of the cabin alone. The cabin was, at this point, more hers than anyone's. She'd put enough of herself into it over the months that it held her shape. She knew every draft, every creak, every particular sound the stove made when it was drawing well versus when it needed the flue adjusted. What she was afraid of was the distance between them and what a distance could mean if something went wrong on either end. But the food was real and the distance was manageable, and so she'd said, "Be back before dark if you can," and watched him go. The first day passed without incident. She kept the fire, did the small maintenance tasks the cabin required, walked to the tree line on the east side in the afternoon when the light was good, and stood in the open air for 20 minutes with her face tipped up to the pale spring sky. The lion sign had been gone for weeks. She wasn't worried about lions. She slept well enough, which surprised her. She'd expected the cabin to feel different without him in it, larger or lonelier or both. But instead it just felt like the cabin. The stove did its work, the walls held. She woke twice in the night to the baby moving and lay there in the dark with her hand on her side, feeling the small pressures and shifts, and thought about names. She hadn't told Gideon she'd been thinking about names. It felt presumptuous somehow, or premature, or like the kind of hope that invited the wrong attention if you spoke it aloud too soon. But lying in the dark, she let herself think it. Eli. She'd always liked Eli. Strong but not hard. A name that left room for the person. On the 2nd day, the weather changed. Not dramatically, not at first. Just the particular quality of light shifting in the mid-morning, the sky going from clear blue to a flat, non-committal gray that could mean anything. She watched it through the window while she worked and told herself it was nothing. Late April in the mountains was variable. She knew that. By afternoon, she wasn't so sure. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the wind had come up from the northwest. Not the whistling, howling kind of wind, but the steady, purposeful kind. The kind that was covering ground toward something. She put 2 more pieces of wood on the fire and went to stand at the window and look north toward where Gideon had gone. Nothing to see but the tree line and the sky above it, gray and flat and getting lower. She made herself eat dinner. She made herself go to bed. She lay awake for a long time. He had said 2 days, maybe 3. This was the end of day 2. She told herself he'd found shelter. He knew this mountain better than anyone alive knew it. He knew every hollow and overhang and lee side that would break the wind. He had his gear. He had his rifle in his pack, and 34 years of hard-won knowledge about how to stay alive in the cold. She told herself all of this in the dark, and it helped some, which was what self-talk usually did. Helped some, not entirely. The storm hit in the early hours of the 3rd morning. She woke to the sound of it and lay still for a moment, listening, calibrating. The wind was significant. The walls of the cabin were doing their work, but the northeast corner was letting in cold air in a way she hadn't felt since deep winter, the canvas she'd hung over it billowing inward against its stitching. Snow was hitting the window in a way that meant horizontal, driven, not falling. A real storm. She built the fire up and sat close to it, and did not let herself think about what a storm like this meant for a man in the high timber with no shelter. Instead, she thought about what he'd told her to do if he didn't come back on schedule. He'd gone through it with her before he left, which she'd resented slightly at the time as overcaution, and was now grateful for with a completeness that felt embarrassing. Malcolm was in the outbuilding with feed enough for 5 days. She knew how to hitch him to a travois if she needed to. Harlan's Creek was a day and a half south on the main trail, which in her current condition and in heavy snow would be 2 days or more. But it was survivable if the weather broke. She didn't leave. She waited. The storm ran through most of the 3rd day and into the night and broke sometime before dawn on day 4, leaving the world outside scrubbed clean and absolutely silent, the snow deep and unbroken in every direction, the sky coming through clear and cold and almost violent in its blueness after so much gray. She was at the stove when she heard Malcolm. The mule made a specific sound when he heard someone approaching he recognized, not the alarm sound. The other one, the low, almost conversational sound he made when he expected something from a particular person. She'd learned this distinction months ago, and she'd never been more grateful for that particular piece of knowledge than in this moment, because the sound meant Gideon, and Gideon meant he'd made it back through whatever the last 2 days had been. She went to the door and opened it, and the cold hit her face, and she looked toward the outbuilding and then past it to where the trail came out of the trees. He was there, at the edge of the tree line. But something was wrong with the way he was moving. She understood it before she could name it. The body knows wrongness before the mind does. He was moving too slowly, and not the slow of exhaustion, which she'd seen before, but a deeper, fundamental slow. His right leg was doing something wrong. He was putting weight on it wrong, carrying it wrong, and he was using the rifle as a walking stick, the barrel end in the snow, leaning on it with each step in a way that told her the leaning was the difference between moving and not moving. She was across the clearing before she made the decision to go, moving as fast as her body would allow, and her body allowed more than she'd expected because the particular fear driving her had no interest in the ordinary limits. She reached him 10 yards from the cabin. Up close he looked worse than from the distance. His face was the gray-white of someone who had spent the last of their reserves getting to where they were standing, the skin around his mouth tight, a darkness under his eyes that was beyond tired. His right leg had blood on it. She could see the dark staining through the tear in his trousers, dried mostly, which meant the injury was at least several hours old. "I'm all right," he said, which was the first thing he said, and it was so obviously not true that she didn't bother responding to it. "Put your arm over my shoulder," she said. "You're not—" "Put your arm over my shoulder, Gideon." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is too tired to argue with logic, which was the only kind of moment where Gideon Voss didn't argue with things. He put his arm over her shoulder. She took his weight, considerable weight, more than she'd expected, and they moved toward the cabin door together, awkward and slow, and not stopping until they were through it, and she'd kicked it shut behind them. She got him to the chair. He sat down like a structure that has been waiting for permission to stop holding itself up. "What happened?" she said. She was already moving to the stove, putting water on, reaching for the clean cloth on the shelf. "Elk," he said. His voice was working, but thin. "Found the herd on the second day. Made the shot. Big bull. The animal went down the slope when it fell, Riss. I had to go down after it, retrieve what I could before the weather came." A pause. The effort of sustained speech was visible. "The slope was iced under the new snow. I went down wrong, caught a rock outcrop. The leg. The leg." He looked down at it, cut it on the rock, deep. She crouched in front of him, ungainly, her center of gravity all wrong now but functional, and looked at the trouser leg. She worked her small knife through the cloth carefully, opening the tear wider. The wound was on the outside of his right thigh, 4 or 5 inches long, a deep gash that had clotted over in an ugly, irregular way. The flesh around it was swollen and hot to the touch, which told her the cold had not been cold enough to prevent the inflammation from starting. It needed cleaning. It needed closing. She sat back and looked at it with the measuring look she normally reserved for other things, the look that took stock and made decisions. "This needs stitching," she said. "I know." A beat. "You know how to do that?" "I've done it once." She looked up at him. "On a person, I mean. I've done it on cloth 100 times. Same principle." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his eyes. Not fear exactly, but the acknowledgement of a situation. "All right," he said. "The needle's on the shelf. 3rd shelf. Left side. In the tin with the thread." He looked at her with a slight exhausted shift in his expression. "You know where all my things are." "I reorganized your shelf in January. I know exactly where everything is." "I had a system," he said, and it was so close to what she'd said to him about the stove that she almost laughed, would have laughed, if her hands hadn't been shaking slightly with the adrenaline working its way out of her. "Your system was putting the needle tin behind the rifle oil," she said. "I put it somewhere it could be found." She stood up, slow and careful, and went to the shelf. The water came to heat. She cleaned the wound first with boiled water and clean cloth, which was the part that required the most from both of them. From her, the steadiness of her hands, and the willingness to do something that caused pain to someone she didn't want to cause pain to. And from him, the absolute stillness of a man who has made a decision about enduring something and is enduring it. He made no sound through the cleaning. His hands on the arms of the chair were tight, the knuckles showing, but he was still. "You got the elk?" she said, talking to give them both something to do with the silence. "Quarters," he said. His voice was even, controlled. "I got the hindquarters into a tree before the storm. Still there if the lion hasn't found it. I'll go back for it when you won't go anywhere for at least a week." "Lena, the leg needs to close properly, a week minimum. I'll go down to Harlan's if we need more supplies." "You are not walking to Harlan's Creek." "Then stop arguing about the elk and let me work." He closed his mouth. She threaded the needle by the firelight, which took her 3 attempts because her hands were still not entirely steady, and she felt him watching her do it with the patient attention of a man who has decided to trust something and is now fully committed to that decision. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," he said, flat and certain. She started at one end of the wound the way she'd been shown once, years ago, by a woman who'd seen too much to waste time being gentle about what needed doing. Small, even stitches, pulling the edges together. She worked slowly and she worked well, or well enough. Her hands found their steadiness once they had something specific to do, which was the thing about her hands. They worked better than the rest of her in a crisis. Always had. He breathed. Slowly. Evenly. She could see the control in it, each breath a deliberate act. "Tell me something," she said. She'd heard once that talking helped, that it gave the pain somewhere to go. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. Something you haven't told me." Another pause. The needle moved. He breathed. "I had a dog when I was 12, he said. His voice was careful, assembled with effort. Brown dog, no particular breed anyone could name. I called him River because I found him at a creek bed. He was with me for 11 years. What happened to him? Old age. He went to sleep one November and didn't wake up. A beat. I was 23. Cried harder than I'd cried about most things. My father thought that was weak. Was it? No, he said. I just had the proportion right, maybe. River was worth crying about. She worked. He talked, in the careful, assembled way, about the dog and about the farm he'd grown up on in Ohio, and about the first winter he'd spent in the mountains, which had nearly killed him twice through pure ignorance before he'd learned enough to stay alive on purpose, rather than by accident. She listened and worked, and the fire did its work, and the wound came together under her hands. Not pretty, but closed, which was what mattered. She tied off the last stitch and sat back and looked at her work. 8 stitches. Even enough. The swelling was concerning, but the wound was clean. She'd been thorough about that. Done, she said. He looked down at it. He reached out and touched the edge of the closed wound with one finger, carefully assessing. That's good work, he said. Don't thank me yet. We need to watch it for infection over the next few days. If it goes hot, I know what infection looks like. Then you know it's serious. I know. He looked up at her. He was pale still, the gray quality in his face not fully gone, but there was something else in his expression. Something that had not been there when he'd walked in from the tree line. Something solid or re-solidified. Thank you, he said. The 2 words came out full, without qualification. She nodded and stood up, moving to wash her hands in the basin, her back to him, because the look on his face had done something to her composure that she needed a moment with privately. She made broth from the last of the salt pork and the dried beans, stretching it with the remaining cornmeal to make it more substantial, and brought it to him where he sat. He ate all of it, which told her how depleted he was. Gideon Voss was not a man who ever showed obvious hunger. The elk quarters, she said, while he ate. Can Malcolm find them? Malcolm doesn't need to find them. I know where they are. You're not going back up that slope. In a week? In a week we'll discuss it. Not before. He looked at her over the bowl. When did you get so bossy? I've always been bossy, she said. You just couldn't tell because you weren't listening to me. Something shifted in his face that was almost a smile. Not quite. Close enough. She cleaned up and moved slowly around the cabin doing the small evening tasks, and he watched her from the chair with the particular tiredness of someone who has been running on fear and effort for 2 days and has finally stopped running, and the stopping was catching up with him all at once. She could see it happening, the eyes getting heavier, the set of his shoulders softening by degrees. Get on the bunk, she said. You can't sleep in the chair with that leg. I've slept in worse positions. Not tonight. She moved to his bunk, his, not hers, because it was closer to the stove and he needed the warmth, and turned back the blanket. Come on. He got up with effort, managing his weight off the bad leg, and moved to the bunk and lay down with the careful precision of someone navigating serious discomfort. She pulled the blanket over him. Her bunk was 2 steps away, and she was tired enough in her own bones that the 2 steps felt like a significant journey. She lay down and pulled her own blanket up and listened to the cabin settle around them. The stove ticking, the roof adjusting to the weight of new snow, the distant sound of the creek finding its spring voice again through the melt. Lena, he said. Yeah. A pause. She waited. I kept thinking about getting back, he said. The whole time. On the slope when I fell. In the timber when the storm was bad. All of it. I kept thinking, I need to get back. She lay still in the dark. Not the supplies, he said. That was part of it, but that wasn't... He stopped. He was not good at this, she knew. At saying the actual thing instead of the thing adjacent to the actual thing. It cost him something visible. I know, she said quietly. I kept thinking about you coming back. Same thing. The fire made its sounds. Outside, the cleared sky was cold and enormous, and full of stars she couldn't see from where she lay. The baby's all right? He asked. The exertion today. The baby is fine, active, very active actually, has been all day. Good. A pause. That's good. She pulled her blanket tighter and closed her eyes. Her body was tired down to the specific tired of someone who'd been holding a lot of tension in a lot of muscles and had only recently been given permission to let it go. Eli, she said to the dark. What? I've been thinking about names. She could feel her voice going slower, heavier, sleep pulling at the edges. I like Eli. He was quiet for a moment. Eli Voss, he said, testing it out. His voice was also slower now, also pulling toward sleep. She hadn't thought about the last name. She lay with it for a moment, the two words together. She hadn't suggested it. He'd said it himself, just like that, naturally, the way you say something that seems obvious once it's out. She didn't answer. She was almost asleep. But she was smiling, in the dark, in the small, warm cabin on the mountain that the storm had swept clean, with a man sleeping 6 feet from her whose life she'd sewn back together with a needle and thread and steady hands, smiling at a name that held both of them in it, and the child that was coming, and everything that a single trade at a crowded trading post had turned into. She slept. Outside, the mountain held its silence, and somewhere in the high timber, 2 elk hindquarters hung in a tree waiting to be retrieved, and the creek below kept finding new notes in its thawing, and the stars over the Rockies burned cold and indifferent and impossibly bright. The leg healed slower than either of them wanted, and faster than Gideon expected, which he credited privately to Lena's insistence on checking the wound twice daily and changing the dressing with a thoroughness that embarrassed him slightly and probably saved him from the infection that had been working at the edges of the stitches on the second and third day. He'd seen the concern in her face those days when she unwrapped it, a tightening around her eyes, a fractional pause before she said anything. And he'd known she was weighing what she was seeing against what she knew, which was not as much as either of them wished she knew. The flesh around 3 of the stitches had gone angry red and warm in a way that was more than ordinary healing. She'd applied a poultice of chamomile and the small amount of drawing salve she'd found in his medical tin, covered it with clean cloth, and told him in a level voice to stay off it for 2 more days. He'd stayed off it for 2 more days. On the 5th morning, the redness had receded to something more like normal healing, and the heat had gone out of it, and she'd exhaled through her nose in a way that wasn't quite relief, but was the practical, controlled version of it, and told him he could start walking on it again. Short distances. Even ground. "You could just say you were worried," he said. She folded the used dressing and didn't look at him. "I was monitoring a wound for signs of infection. That's not the same as worried. It's related." "Put your boot on," she said. He put his boot on. The elk quarters came down from the tree on the 8th day after his return, which he managed by riding Malcolm up to the site rather than walking it, a compromise she'd extracted from him through the particular negotiating tactics she'd developed over the months of making her position completely clear and then waiting in silence until he ran out of counter-arguments. He came back with the quarters loaded across Malcolm's back, frozen solid from the nights and still good, and spent the afternoon butchering them on the flat rock south of the cabin while she watched from the doorway with her arms crossed over her belly in the way she'd started standing lately, unconsciously supporting the weight. "Enough?" she asked. "More than enough," he said. 4 weeks, maybe 5 if we're careful." She nodded and went back inside, and he worked, and the mountain smelled like pine sap and cold air, and something green and new that was working up through the snow in the patches where the sun reached longest in the afternoon. May arrived. He knew it by the calendar scratched in the shelf post, and by the way the mountain changed around him. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, 1 degree of warmth at a time, the snow retreating up the slopes by visible inches each week, the creek below running full and loud now, muscular with snowmelt, and the aspens putting out their first tentative leaves in a green so pale it was almost white. Lena was 8 months along, or close enough that the distinction had become academic. She moved through the cabin with the deliberate care of someone navigating a space that had become slightly too small, and she slept badly now. He could hear her shifting in the night, adjusting, occasionally getting up to walk the 4 steps to the window and back, the small sounds of a body that could not find comfortable rest. He said nothing about it in the mornings, but he left the fire built higher at night so the cabin stayed warm for the walking. She was not outwardly afraid. That was one of the things he'd learned about Lena Hart over the months. That fear in her was internal, kept there by intention, not allowed to surface in her face or her voice if she could prevent it. But he'd gotten good at reading the signs that she kept covered. The way she ran her thumbnail along the seam of her sleeve when she was worried about something. The way she read the same page of his frontier medicine book 3 times without turning it. The way she inventoried the birth supplies on the shelf with a regularity that had nothing to do with checking their presence and everything to do with needing the ritual of checking. He understood ritual. He had his own. Checking the rifle even when he hadn't fired it, walking the perimeter of the cabin at dusk. Small, repeated actions that gave the hands something to do while the mind sat with things it couldn't resolve. On a night in the first week of May, a clear night, cold still but the cold of early spring now, not the cold of winter, he sat at the table and she sat across from him, and they were both quiet, and the quiet was companionable in a way that he still sometimes noticed because the noticing hadn't fully worn off. The awareness that this had not always been here, this particular ease. "Tell me again," she said. He looked up. "What part?" "The part about when the baby comes. What to do first." He told her twice. She knew. This was the ritual. He told her again, in the same order, the same words where he could manage them. She listened with her eyes on the table, following along internally, checking his version against hers, and when he finished, she nodded once. "What's the cord?" she said. "Clean twine, wet it first, tie it twice, leave 3 inches. And the breathing? If the baby doesn't breathe right away, rub the back, firmly, don't wait. And if I—" She stopped. He waited. "If I can't finish," she said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was applied. "If something goes wrong with me and I can't— Lena, I need to know you'll take care of the baby regardless of what— Nothing is going to go wrong with you." That's not an answer. She looked up at him then, direct and unflinching. "I need the actual answer." He held her look. He understood what she was asking and why she was asking it, and he understood that she needed the real answer, not the reassuring one, and that the real answer was the only one she would accept. "Yes," he said, "regardless of anything, I'll take care of the baby." She held his look for a moment longer and then looked back down at the table. "Eli Voss," she said quietly. "Eli Voss," he agreed. She pressed her lips together and nodded once more, and then picked up the piece of cloth she'd been working on. Small cloth, very small, a garment of some kind that he hadn't asked about, and went back to the stitching. He went back to sharpening his knife, which didn't need sharpening, and they sat in the firelight until the oil in the lamp ran low and she went to bed, and he sat alone for a while with the fire and the sound of the creak through the log walls, and the particular weight of the promise he'd just made, which was different from other promises he'd made in his life. Heavier, more real, the kind of promise where you feel the shape of what it would cost to keep it before it's ever called on. He sat with that shape for a long time. Then he went to bed. The labor started on the 12th of May, which he knew because he'd been marking the days with increasing attention. It started quietly, the way things sometimes started before they became what they were going to be. He woke in the gray pre-dawn to the sound of Lena getting up, nothing unusual in itself, and he lay still and listened to her walk to the window and back, the same as other nights. But she didn't lie back down. After a few minutes, he said without moving, "How long?" A pause. "Since about midnight," she said. "Maybe before. I wasn't sure at first." He sat up. "Why didn't you—" "Because I wasn't sure," she said, "and because there's nothing to do yet. Early labor takes time, sometimes a long time." Her voice was controlled, just slightly more deliberate than normal. "I know how this works." He got up anyway and built the fire up and put water to heat, because water needed to be hot and clean and available. And doing something was better than lying in the dark, listening to her breathe through whatever she was breathing through. The morning came in gray, and then the gray turned to something worse. By 7 o'clock, the sky out the window had the look he'd come to read as trouble. A specific stacking of clouds from the southwest, low and fast-moving, the kind that carried real weather. He stood at the window for a long moment calculating it. "Storm coming," he said. "I know." She was sitting on her bunk with her hands on her knees, upright, doing the deliberate breathing. "How bad?" "Bad enough." He looked at her. "It'll hit by afternoon." She looked at the window, and then at him, and the look between them acknowledged what they both understood without either of them saying it. No help coming. The cabin isolated by a spring storm that was probably going to run several hours. No second set of experienced hands. Just the two of them and everything they'd prepared for and everything they hadn't. "Then we do it ourselves," she said. "Same as everything else." He nodded. He went to the shelf and checked the supplies for the 4th time. The cloth, the twine, the boiled knife in its folded wrapping, the chamomile, the clean basin. Everything where it was supposed to be. The morning passed in a rhythm of activity and waiting. She walked when the contractions allowed it, which she said helped, and he stayed close without hovering, which required a particular kind of self-discipline he hadn't known he had. He kept the fire, kept the water hot, brought her broth that she drank half of, rubbed her lower back when she asked him to without being asked twice. She was laboring honestly by mid-morning, the contractions close enough that the intervals between them were running short. He could see the effort in her face, not panic, not tears, but the concentrated inward look of someone doing very hard physical work and doing it with full intention. She breathed through each contraction with her eyes closed and her hands gripping the edge of the bunk frame, and between them she opened her eyes and was present again, talking in short sentences, asking him to check the water temperature, telling him what she needed. "You're doing well," he said, once. She opened one eye and looked at him sidelong. "You don't know that." "I know you're still talking in sentences. That seems good." "Very reassuring," she said, and then a contraction took her, and the next 30 seconds were not the time for talking. The storm hit in the early afternoon, the same way the last big storm had hit in December. The pressure dropping first, then the wind picking up from the southwest, then the sky going dark and the first hard slap of rain, and then sleet against the window. Not snow this time, which was something. The temperature was above freezing, barely, but sleet, driven at an angle, and behind it the real body of the storm with thunder in it, which was rare in the mountains, and strange, and the sound of it filled the cabin with a different kind of weight. Lena was on her feet when the thunder hit, walking the 4 steps from bunk to stove and back, one hand on the wall. She stopped when the sound rolled through and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "That's new," she said. "Spring storm. Happens sometimes." "Add it to the list," she said, and kept walking. He did not know how people did this, he thought, watching her. Not the birth. He was beginning to understand the birth, in the practical terms he'd learned and the larger terms he was learning in real time. He meant the courage of it, the sheer animal, physical courage of a woman laboring in a cabin in a storm on a mountain with nothing but a trapper who'd read 4 pages about it, and the strength she'd been building all her life out of everything that had tried to break her. He'd seen courage before. He'd been in situations that required it of him. But this was different. This was a thing she couldn't put down, couldn't walk away from, couldn't manage from a distance. She was in it completely, and she was not going anywhere, and she just kept moving, kept breathing, kept doing the work. Around mid-afternoon, she stopped walking. "I need to lie down," she said. Something in her voice was different, lower, more internal. He helped her to the bunk and she gripped his arm, getting down, and didn't let go right away. Her fingers tight in the fabric of his sleeve through a contraction that was longer than the ones before, and he stayed still and let her grip him and didn't move until it passed. "That one was different," she said. "Different how?" "Getting closer to—" She stopped. "It's getting close." He got the basin, got the cloth, checked the knife. His hands were steady. He noticed this with a detachment that felt strange, the way you notice peripheral things when the central thing is taking all your focus. What followed was the longest 2 hours of his life. Not because things went immediately wrong. They didn't, not at first, but labor was its own country, and he was new to it, and every sound she made, every shift in her breathing, every moment of silence when she went somewhere deeply internal and far from the room, each of these moved through him with an intensity that had no comparison in his experience. Not the hunting trip, not the injury, not the long solitary winters. This was different because he was not the one at risk, and that he discovered was infinitely harder than being the one at risk. He coached when she needed coaching and was quiet when she needed quiet. He wiped her face with a damp cloth. He told her when she asked how it was going, exactly what he could see, which was what she wanted. Not reassurance, but information. Always information with Lena, data she could work with. He held her hand when she reached for him, which she did more than he expected, and he understood that the hand-holding was not weakness, but the opposite, was her bringing him into the effort, sharing it, letting the circuit close. About an hour in, she said through clenched teeth, "I need you to talk to me." "About what?" "Anything. Something real." Her eyes were closed. Her knuckles were white. "Something outside this room." He thought for half a second and started talking about the mountain, about the elk herd he'd found on the north ridge and the way they moved through the timber at dawn, 15 animals in a loose group. The big bull at the rear with his head swinging side to side in that way elk had of reading the wind. About the creek and spring flood below them, and the way the sound of it changed day by day as the snowmelt peaked and began to ease. About the spring he'd found the previous summer on the east slope, fed by some deep aquifer, running cold and clear even in August when everything else was low, and how he'd built a small stone basin around it to keep it clean. She listened. He talked. The storm shook the window. Then she made a sound that stopped him mid-sentence. Not a scream, more like every bit of air leaving her body at once with effort behind it. And he stopped talking and was entirely there. "Now," she said. Just the one word. He did what he knew to do. He had done his best to learn, and he did what he'd learned, and he was not graceful, and he was not certain, but he was present and careful, and he did not let his hands shake when they needed to be still. It took another 40 minutes. There were moments in those 40 minutes that he would never put into words, because the words didn't exist in his vocabulary or anyone else's for what it cost her and what it took from both of them. She was past the controlled breathing and past the measured sentences, and she was just working, fighting, in the most fundamental physical sense of the word, in a way that made everything he'd ever thought of as hard work seem like a different category of thing entirely. And he was with her, completely. There was nothing else in the world during those 40 minutes. No mountain, no storm, no history of grief or solitude or carefully maintained distance. There was only this room and this woman and what was happening and what he had to do. "Push," he said, at the moment that mattered. And she did. And the sound she made was the sound of a person spending the last of something enormous. And then silence. A silence of 4 seconds that was the longest 4 seconds of his life. A silence so complete that he could hear the sleet on the window and the fire in the stove and his own blood moving through his ears. A silence that reached into his chest and grabbed what was there, the grief and the old fear, the memory of 2 small graves in an Ohio field, and pulled it forward into the present moment with a cruelty so precise it took his breath. Not again, he thought. It wasn't a prayer. It was just what moved through him, raw and wordless, in those 4 seconds. Not again, not again, not... The baby cried, small and outraged and absolutely, undeniably alive, a cry that started thin and then found its body, its full lung capacity, the specific fury of a new person encountering cold air and light and the shock of existence all at once. A real sound, an insisting sound. Gideon's hands were shaking now. He hadn't let them shake when they needed to be still. Now they shook. "Is he?" Lena's voice was barely above a whisper, exhausted down to the foundation of her. "Gideon, is he?" "He's here," Gideon said. His own voice came out wrong, thick and low, and he didn't try to fix it. "He's here. He's fine. He's fine, Lena." He wrapped the baby in the clean cloth he had ready. Small, very small, but good weight, good color, good sound. And he cut and tied the cord with the steady precision that came from the part of him that was still functional, that could still operate through what the rest of him was doing, and then he brought the baby to her and put him in her arms. She took him with the same instinct she'd shown in every crisis. Completely. No hesitation, her arms knowing what to do before she'd consciously decided. She pulled him against her chest and looked at his face and made a sound that was not a word and contained everything. Gideon sat on the edge of the bunk beside her. He looked at the baby's face, the red, scrunched, furious face of a person who has just been through something and would like everyone to know it. And he put one large, rough hand against the baby's head, which was smaller than his palm. And he sat there while the storm moved through its middle hours outside and the fire kept the room warm. He became aware after a while that he was crying. Not dramatically, just quietly, in the way exhausted people sometimes cried when something that had been very tight for a very long time finally came loose. He didn't try to stop it. It wasn't the kind of thing you stopped. Lena saw it. She was watching him, the baby against her chest, and she saw it, and she didn't say anything for a moment. "Thomas," she said quietly, "you're thinking about him." He didn't answer, which was an answer. He would have been a good big brother, she said. "I think." He looked at her. She looked at him. Her face was wrecked with exhaustion, and her hair was half loose, and she was the most clear-eyed he'd ever seen her, which seemed like a contradiction, and wasn't. "Yeah," he said. His voice was still wrong. He would have been. The baby made a sound between them. Not a cry this time, something smaller, an investigation, a testing of the air, and both of them looked at him. "Hi, Eli," Lena said, soft and direct, the way she said everything that mattered. The baby's face moved in the direction of her voice. His eyes were closed, but he moved toward the sound the way plants move toward light, without decision, just with the whole body toward the thing it needed most. Gideon stayed where he was. He was not sure he was capable of moving. He was not sure he wanted to. Outside, the storm was thinning. The sleet had gone back to rain, and the rain was lighter, and beneath it the creek was running loud and full and unworried, and the mountain held everything on it. The cabin, the people inside it, the new and specific weight of one more life that had not been there this morning, with the same monumental indifference it had always held everything. The indifference that could be comforting or terrible, depending on the day. Tonight, it was neither. Tonight it was just the mountain being the mountain, doing what mountains did. And in a small cabin at its base, a baby breathed, and a woman rested, and a man who had come up here to get away from everything found that everything had come up here to find him, and that he was, for the first time in a very long time, not sorry about that. He sat there until Lena slept, which didn't take long. She was asleep between one breath and the next, the deep shutdown of a body that has earned its rest completely. The baby slept against her, rising and falling with her breath. He sat a while longer, just in the quiet, just with the fire and the rain and the breathing. Then he got up, slowly, and added wood to the stove, and checked the latch on the door against the remaining wind, and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the rain-dark mountain. He thought about the trading post, the wolf pelt in his hands, the hollow look in a young woman's eyes. The 1 second of decision that had not felt like a decision at all, just a thing he did before the thinking caught up with the doing. He thought about what that 1 second had become. He put his hand flat on the cold glass of the window for a moment, feeling the temperature differential. Warmth on one side, cold on the other, the cabin holding the line between them. Then he turned back to the room, to the fire, to the woman sleeping, to the baby who had cried finally, after those 4 seconds that had nearly undone him, and who was now breathing with the absolute conviction of someone who intended to keep doing it for a very long time. He sat back down in his chair. He stayed. Eli Voss was 11 days old the first time Gideon carried him outside. It was a morning in late May, the kind of morning the mountains occasionally produced as if to apologize for everything they'd put you through. Clear sky, no wind, the air carrying a temperature that was neither cold nor warm, but the exact neutral of something perfectly calibrated. The snow was gone from everything below the upper ridge line. The aspens were in full leaf now, that deep settling green that came after the pale first flush, and the meadow south of the cabin had come up in grass and early wildflowers that Lena had been looking at through the window for 3 days with the specific restlessness of someone who needed to be outside and had been told by her body, firmly, not yet. Gideon had wrapped the baby against his chest in a length of cloth Lena had configured and demonstrated twice, and the third time she'd offered to demonstrate, he'd told her he had it. And he walked out into the morning and stood in the clearing south of the cabin and let Eli have the sky. The baby was not impressed, or if he was, he expressed it by going very still and doing the thing he did sometimes where his eyes moved slowly across whatever was in front of him with a concentration so complete it looked like work. Gideon had noticed this about him in the 11 days, that he was watchful, that he paid attention with his whole body. He didn't know if that was a baby thing generally or an Eli thing specifically, but he'd noticed it. "That's south," he told the baby, turning slightly. "Ridge runs east-west up there. Below that is where I run traps in winter. Those aspens by the creek, sus? That's where the elk water in dry season." He turned again. "North is the hunting territory. Above that ridge is where I found the herd in April." He paused. "Where I got the leg." Eli moved one hand free of the wrapping and opened and closed it at nothing in particular, which Gideon had also noticed him doing, testing what the air felt like. "The creek you can hear is about a 1/4 mile down slope. It runs fast until July, then settles." He looked at the line of water sound below them, invisible through the trees. "Good fishing in August if you know where to stand." He stood there for a while, longer than he'd meant to, talking to a person who understood none of it, and apparently found it interesting anyway. The morning did its quiet work around them. Lena appeared in the cabin doorway. She was moving better now, still carefully, still with the awareness of recent damage, but upright and self-propelled, and very clearly done with being managed. She told him the previous evening in the flat, certain tones she used for facts rather than negotiations, that she was getting up tomorrow and doing things, and he could either help or stay out of the way. He'd said he'd help, and she'd nodded as though this was the expected and correct answer. She stood in the doorway now with her arms crossed and looked at the two of them in the clearing. "What are you telling him?" she called. "Geography." She was quiet for a moment. "He's 11 days old. He's paying attention." She looked at Eli, who had his face turned toward the sound of her voice with the direction-finding instinct that had been operating since approximately day 2. A small smile crossed her face, the real kind, the one she didn't put on. "Come inside," she said. "It's time to eat." He turned and walked back to the cabin, and she took the baby from him at the door, unhooking the cloth with the practiced efficiency she'd developed faster than him, no question. And he went to the stove to check the fire and thought about geography and what it meant to show someone a place as though it belonged to them, as though they were going to need to know it. He thought about that for a while without quite resolving it into words. The first weeks with a baby in the cabin were not what he would have called easy, and he would not have expected them to be, but they were not what he'd feared either, which was chaos without structure. The structure was imposed by Eli's needs, which were consistent, demanding, and operated without regard for the time on any imaginary clock. And he and Lena organized themselves around those needs with the same practical cooperation they'd developed over the winter. He took the early morning hours. She had more of the night. They traded without discussion, reading each other's tiredness the way they'd learned to read each other's silences. Not perfectly, sometimes getting it wrong, occasionally snapping at each other in the specific way exhausted people did, but correcting course. He got snapped at on the 3rd day for reorganizing the shelf back to his original system while she was sleeping. "I reorganized it for a reason," she said, not loudly, but with the precise edge of someone who has been woken by a baby 3 times in 6 hours and is operating at reduced tolerance. "The way you had it didn't work. The salt sack issue was a symptom. Your system has no logic to it. You put things where they fit rather than where they belong. Those are the same. They are not the same." She put the chamomile back on the upper left shelf where she'd had it and looked at him with the expression he recognized as her version of "I am right, and we both know it, and I would like you to acknowledge this so we can move on. If you need to reorganize something, reorganize the outbuilding. I've never touched the outbuilding." He had no good answer for this. He went and reorganized the outbuilding, which genuinely needed it, and when he came back she had made coffee and poured him a cup without being asked, which was her version of acknowledging that the conversation was over and concluded reasonably. Eli, for his part, seemed untroubled by all of it. There was a specific moment in the 3rd week of June that Gideon returned to later when he tried to identify when things had shifted from surviving this situation together into something he didn't have a clean word for. He'd come in from a short trap check, the first since the birth, a careful 2-hour circuit of the nearby lines, and found Lena sitting in his chair. She'd never sat in his chair before. It wasn't a rule, wasn't something he'd said, just a pattern that had established itself. But she was in the chair now, with Eli asleep against her shoulder, and she'd fallen asleep herself, her head tilted back against the chair's wooden frame at an angle that was going to hurt her neck when she woke up. He stood just inside the door for a moment and looked at them. The baby's face was turned against her shoulder, the small, serious face slack and open in sleep in a way it wasn't when he was awake. She was breathing slowly, deeply, with the abandon of someone who had finally gotten horizontal, or nearly horizontal, and wasn't wasting it. He took off his things quietly. He put the fire up without making noise. He sat on the edge of his bunk and picked up his book and stayed there, not reading, just in the room. He didn't examine what he was feeling. He'd gotten better at not examining things in real time, and worse at suppressing them entirely, which felt like progress of some kind, though the progress was uncomfortable. What he was feeling was large and unresolved and had no clean edge to it, and it had been building since approximately January and had been building faster since May 12th. And he suspected it was going to require an action at some point that he was not entirely ready for, but was becoming less unready for as the weeks passed. She woke up after an hour and straightened slowly and put a hand to her neck with a wince. I told you that chair was the wrong angle, he said. She looked at him with the half-focused look of someone freshly awake. When did you tell me that? February. You sat in it to read for an hour and complained about your neck afterward. I don't remember that. I do. Eli stirred against her and she shifted him automatically, the adjustment that had become part of how she moved, and he settled back into sleep. She looked at Gideon over the baby's head. How long have you been back? She asked. About an hour? She processed this. That he'd been there an hour and sat quietly rather than waking her, and something moved through her expression that she didn't quite cover in time. She looked at the window. You should have woken me up, she said. You needed the sleep. I had things to... They waited. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, but the moment had a quality to it that they'd been accumulating over the months without quite naming, the way you accumulate weather. She looked back at Eli's sleeping face. He's going to be taller than you, she said. Look at his hands, big hands. Where'd you get that from? Can't tell hand size at 3 weeks. I can tell, she said, with the absolute certainty she applied to things she'd decided. He looked at the baby's hands. He thought she was probably right. He said nothing, which was his way of conceding. Renly Hart arrived in the first week of July. He came up the South Trail on a borrowed horse, thin still, thinner than Gideon remembered from the trading post, but upright and with more color in his face than he'd had that December morning. He'd heard in Harlan's Creek that his sister had come through the winter, and the birth, and was on the mountain still, and he'd spent 3 weeks working himself up to making the trip. Gideon saw him coming from 200 yards and went to the doorway of the cabin and said, without turning around, Someone on the South Trail, man on a horse, looks like your brother. The silence behind him had a specific quality. All right, she said after a moment. She was standing in the doorway behind him when Renly rode into the clearing, and Renly pulled up his horse and looked at his sister for a long moment before he looked at anything else. And the look on his face was the look of a man doing several kinds of accounting at once. Relief, guilt, something that had been held tight for months beginning to ease its pressure. He got off the horse, and they stood in the clearing, the three of them, with the summer mountain around them and the creek audible below, and a silence that needed working through before anything else could happen. Lena, Renly said. His voice came out rough. Renly, she said, flat, controlled, giving nothing away yet. He looked at her, really looked, taking in the months he hadn't been there for, the changes in her he couldn't fully read from the outside. I heard about the baby, he said. I heard it was a boy, that he was... He swallowed. That they were both all right. He is. I am. A pause. The guilt was winning in his face, losing the competition with relief. I didn't know what else to do, he said. In Harlan's Creek. I know that doesn't... I know, she said. Her voice was not warm, but it was not hard either. It was the voice of someone who had processed something thoroughly and arrived somewhere that wasn't forgiveness exactly, not yet, but was the country next to it. I know you didn't. Renly looked at Gideon. There was a complicated thing in that look. A man measuring another man against what he'd done and what he'd failed to do and what the result of both had turned out to be. Thank you, Renly said, for... He stopped. I don't know the right word for it. You don't need one, Gideon said. Renly nodded. He reached into his saddlebag and produced a cloth bundle, held it out toward his sister. From Harlan's wife. She heard and sent, I don't know what it is, small clothes, I think, for the baby. Lena took the bundle. She held it for a moment and some of the armor came off her face, just some, just around the eyes. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. Renly stayed 3 days. It was not entirely comfortable. 3 days never were when there was something that needed working through between people. But it was honest, which was the better quality. And by the end of the 3rd day, something had been said between Lena and her brother that Gideon was not present for and did not ask about. But the shape of it was visible afterward in the way she carried herself. A specific tension gone from her shoulders that he'd been watching so long he'd stopped seeing it. The morning Renly left, he shook Gideon's hand in the clearing and held it a beat longer than necessary. She's stubborn, Renly said quietly. Not a complaint, just information. I know, Gideon said. She doesn't say things directly when she feels them. A pause. But she feels them. Gideon looked at him. I know that too. Renly nodded once and got on his horse and went down the south trail. And Gideon watched him go and turned back to the cabin and found Lena in the doorway watching him with the measuring look that he understood now was not distance but the opposite. Was her full attention, concentrated and precise. What did he say to you? She asked. That you're stubborn. She looked at him for a moment. What did you say? That I know. She held his look for a long moment. Then she turned and went back inside and he followed her. The summer built itself out in long golden days that he hadn't experienced in years because he'd been sleeping through them, or away at his traps, or simply not paying the kind of attention that required someone else's eyes alongside yours to see things properly. He'd lived on this mountain for 7 years, and there were things about it he was seeing as though for the first time. The way the light came through the aspens in the late afternoon, hitting the leaves at an angle that turned them nearly translucent. The way the creek, back to its summer level now, had sounds within sounds, if you sat near it long enough to hear them separately. Eli was 3 months old in August, which was not old by any reasonable measure, but old enough that he was no longer purely reactive, was beginning to have preferences, opinions, responses that were specific rather than general. He preferred Gideon's voice for sleeping and Lena's face for waking, which was not a scientific finding but was consistent enough to be notable. He was going to be large, which was becoming clearer as the weeks passed, and Lena had taken to saying, I told you about the hands with a frequency that Gideon found more entertaining than he admitted. One evening in late August, with the summer beginning its first slow turn towards something cooler, Gideon sat outside the cabin on the woodpile and looked at the mountain he'd been on for 7 years, and he thought about what it meant to choose something versus to be chosen by it, and whether the distinction held up under examination. He'd come up here to get away from love, he understood now. Not consciously. He'd told himself 100 versions of what he was doing, and almost none of them had been, I am running from the fact that I loved people and they died, and I cannot do that again. But that was what it had been. The mountain was safe because it didn't love you back, and couldn't leave you and couldn't die. It was just the mountain, perpetually, indifferent and enormous and uncomplicated. He'd been wrong about the uncomplicated part. He now understood. The mountain was not uncomplicated. He'd just been too far inside his own loss to see what it actually contained. Lena came and sat beside him. Not close, not touching, but beside him on the woodpile with the ease of someone who had stopped needing to calibrate every distance. She had Eli asleep in the cloth against her chest, which he could see in his peripheral vision, the small head resting. They sat for a while without talking, which was still one of the things they did best. I've been thinking, she said eventually, about the spring garden, the plot on the south face. She looked at it, the rough square of turned earth he'd started years ago and maintained minimally, growing what he could with what he knew, which wasn't much. It could be 3 times the size. The soil's good further west, I looked at it, and if we put in onions properly this year, they'll be established by next spring. He looked at the garden plot. That's a lot of work. I know how to do it, she said. I did a kitchen garden for 3 years in Indiana. I know what I'm doing with soil. I never said you didn't. I'm saying I want to expand it, make it worth having. He looked at her profile. She was looking at the garden, already planning it, already seeing whatever she saw when she looked at ground. Potential, he supposed, the same way he looked at a trap line and saw the whole season. All right, he said. She nodded, satisfied, the way she was satisfied when a decision had been reached that she'd already known was right. He'd gotten used to this about her and found, to his own mild surprise, that he didn't mind it. Lena, he said. She turned and looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her go still in the way she went still when something was coming that she was going to have to decide about. He wasn't good at this. He knew he wasn't. He'd spent 7 years in the company of a mule and some traps and a small library, and he'd let the words rust in a way they didn't fully come back from. But she knew that about him, and he thought, had been thinking for some time, that she would rather have the imperfect attempt than the silence. I don't know how to say what I mean, he said. Exactly. Try the approximate version, she said. Her voice was careful, but her eyes were the open kind, the kind that weren't measuring, that had set down the instrument. What we have here, he said. He gestured once, briefly, at the cabin and the garden and the mountain and all of it. I don't want to call it one thing because I'm afraid to call it the wrong thing. A pause. But I want it to stay. Whatever it is. I want it to be on purpose. Going forward. She was quiet for a moment. It already is, she said. On purpose. I know. I just wanted to say it out loud. She looked at him for a long time. The measuring look came back, but softer, the way it had gotten softer around the edges since Eli was born. Not gone, never gone, just recalibrated to something she'd decided to trust. Okay, she said. Just that. He'd learned by now that her okay was not a deflection. It was completion. It was her taking something in and settling it into the permanent category. He looked back at the mountain. She looked at the garden. Eli slept between them, making the small random sounds of a sleeping baby, the sounds of a person doing the uncomplicated work of growing. The sun dropped behind the upper ridge, and the shadow came across the meadow in its usual way. The way it had come across this meadow every evening for as long as the mountain had been here, which was longer than anything Gideon could reasonably think about. The air cooled by 5 degrees in the space of a few minutes, as it always did when the sun went, and they both felt it at the same time and stood up at the same time without speaking and went inside. He built the fire. She settled Eli in the small crib he'd built in the second week after the birth. Better work than the bunk. He'd had more time and more motivation. And came to the stove and stood near the heat with her arms crossed, and watched him work. The northeast corner, she said. This winter, the gap needs to be chinked properly. You've been putting it off for 3 years. 2 years. 3. I counted. A beat. I'll help. You don't know how to chink a wall. You can show me, she said. Simple as that. As if being shown things was not a concession, but a reasonable use of the time available. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the fire between them was warm, and the cabin was as it had always been. Small, adequate, imperfect, built for solitude by a man who'd needed it, and now needed something else. The same walls. The same stove ticking as the iron expanded. The same northeast corner letting in its thin thread of cold air, which would, this year, actually get fixed. Different, and the same, and better for both. He thought about Harlan's Creek sometimes. The specific geometry of that room, the placement of the flour sacks, the quality of the light through the one small window. He thought about the wolf pelt in his hands, and the decision that wasn't a decision, the moment where his body moved before his reasons caught up with it. He used to think that was weakness. Acting without reasons. He'd spent years building a life entirely on reasons, on the clean, uncomplicated logic of survival in a place that didn't ask anything emotional of you. What he understood now, sitting in his cabin, with a woman reorganizing his shelf, and a baby asleep in a crib he'd built, and a leg that pulled slightly when the weather changed. A reminder of what it cost to come back from the high ground. What he understood now was that the best things he'd ever done had been done before the reasons arrived. The reasons came after, confirming something the rest of him had already known. Some things you don't think your way into. You just step forward into the cold air of a trading post in December and let the rest of your life begin from there. Lena put coffee on. He sat down at the table. Outside, the mountain held the dark with its usual permanence. The stars coming out over the upper ridgeline one by one, the creek talking to itself below, and somewhere north in the timber, an elk herd moving through the aspens toward water, doing the thing they'd always done. The way everything up here kept doing what it had always done, steady and enormous and not waiting for anyone. But inside the cabin on the south slope, something was different tonight than it had been a year ago. The fire was the same fire. The walls were the same walls. The man was, in most observable ways, the same man, except that the silence was no longer empty, except that the chair across the table was no longer unfilled, except that the name scratched into the shelf post, the calendar he'd kept in the solitary way of a man who needed to know what day it was without knowing why it mattered, was no longer something he maintained only for himself. He was keeping the days now for all three of them. That was the whole of it, really. Not a revelation, not a transformation. Just a man who had spent years keeping time for no one finding out, slowly and imperfectly and without clean resolution, that time kept for others was a different kind of time entirely. That it was in fact the only kind worth keeping. Lena set the coffee in front of him and sat down across the table, And the fire made its sounds, and Eli breathed in his crib, and the mountain did what mountains do, endured and waited, and held whatever was placed on it without judgment. And the two of them sat in the warmth of what they'd made, which was not perfect, which would never be perfect, which was built from hard months and close calls and two people too stubborn to stay broken. And that was enough. That had always been enough if you were willing to see it. That had always, in the end, been everything.
Thank you, Brimbo. For what? Oh, for the spiky hair? You're welcome, I tried. Teach him a lesson. I don't know what I did to warrant these lessons that I'm being taught. Are we doing lethal or no?
I will play it with Chandler. With Chandler.
Get Sam in here. Get Sam in here. Get Aya in here. Does Aya play this
Sam,
game?
join up.
Come on, Sam, get in.
Get in here, Sam.
Can you tell Daddy to... No. Because I don't know what that is asking me. I think I'm gonna start a long dark run tonight, though. And I have a movie to take notes on. Huh? I get too scared. A movie to take notes on? Oh, for your class. What movie is it? So are we not playing lethal? I'll see you guys later, please. See ya, Aya. Bye-bye. Ben?
Oh, I'm down.
Okay. Well, Daddy isn't responding, so I really just don't know. Bye. We love you. Bye-bye. New horror. Psycho Killer. I think I've seen that. Or not the movie, but I've seen the trailer. Apparently really bad. That's also what I heard. So we will see. I guess we shall. So if I yell on the mic, I do apologize. Okay, Daddy is playing. I guess we're doing it. Bye, Aya. Ooh, ooh. Dun, dun, dun. I do. Will you do Monster Hunter World now? Fuck no. I remember I played one of those Monster Hunter games and I figured out how to make like the meat and I could never kill a single monster and I got off because I was like a fucking 5-year-old.